For this video, I'm going to very briefly describe what I'd like you to try to do as part of your literary history presentation. So basically, we're going to be looking at 11 periods of literary history over 11 weeks in the middle part of the semester, starting in week 3, running to the end of November. Each of you will sign up to be responsible for one period of literary history. What I'd like you to do is to look for the article that's listed in your period of literary history, read the article, prepare to lead some discussion of that article. This discussion is going to be virtual. It's going to happen in bulletin boards and so on. So different than if we were in person. But basically for you to post some questions that might help your classmates think about what's interesting or important about that article. And then, and here's the part that's unique to whoever is working on that particular week, for you to make a presentation based on this article as a sort of entry point for thinking about what's going on, what's important, what's the trend in that period of literary history. So let me sort of lead you through this as if you were going to do week 1, the medieval literary history section. So assuming that you signed up for the period of literary history that we call medieval literature, you would locate the article that's described in the column for week 3. Try to do that far in advance of September the 13th when everything is going to wrap up of our discussion there. You would locate that article, read it and think about it critically, generate some questions that would help us think about what's at stake in that article, and post those questions to the bulletin board. And then prepare using either, say, PowerPoint or some other kind of presentation software that you feel comfortable using. You could use YouTube, which is what I'm doing to make these videos, for instance, and lead us through a discussion of that article. Now, that article is about Chaucer. It's about the Reeve's Tale, which is one of the Canterbury Tales, and it takes up a number of issues. I don't want to get too far ahead and saying what those issues are, but you would read that article, see what kind of issues are raised in that article. It's a fairly current piece of scholarship, 2009, I think. And then you would talk about, well, so how did this article work? What's the argument in this article? What are the main points that the author makes in discussing the Reeve's Tale? And what sort of theoretical questions maybe are coming up, or just anything you think is interesting or important about that article. And then, as part of your presentation, and this is maybe the harder part, but where you have to work a little bit independently, I'd like you to try to think about how this article might offer a window into what's going on in medieval scholarship, scholarship on the medieval period presently. So there are two things you probably ought to do at that point. First would be to go to the MLA bibliography and look up what sort of things are being published on medieval literature over the last, say, 5 or 10 years. This article happens to be 10 years old. Maybe you would just say, what kinds of topics are being treated in studies of medieval literature over the last 10 years? So this particular article, you'll see that it has a lot to say about gender, a lot to say about power relationships in gender, and it also has some things to say about the medieval relationship to comedy and the medieval relationship to the past, to antiquity. And so maybe you'll see that there's a real trend. I mean, I'm not a medievalist, so I'm not sure. Maybe there's a real trend in talking about the medieval relationship to its past. Or maybe there's a real trend of talking about sort of inappropriate comedy. I mean, the article happens to deal with issues of sexual consent, but makes some jokes about that, and so maybe that's maybe that's a topic that other medievalists are working on. It happens to be about Chaucer, obviously, and so you can sort of see what kinds of things are people saying about Chaucer nowadays. So that's one thing, to survey current scholarship on stuff in that on arguments in that field, and tell us a little bit about what are some of the kind of critical questions and trends in that period of literary history that you've selected. And then the second thing would be to tell us a little bit about what's important in that field. So here, I would recommend getting out a couple of literary anthologies. Get out the Norton Anthology of British Literature. If you have your hands on the Broadview Anthology, you could get the Broadview Anthology of British Literature. There are a couple of other anthologies that you could look at. And tell us, what are some of the other authors? Chaucer is obviously an important author when talking about medieval literature, but just based on the table of contents of some of those anthologies, what are some of the other important authors to know about? If the article that you selected was not about a kind of centrally canonical author, but maybe someone who's kind of more on the margins, who's being recovered and brought back into our discussion of that period, maybe you would talk about, here's this article. It's about an author who has been neglected for many years, who is not even listed in the Norton Anthology anymore, but who is there are a bunch of articles about this author now, and maybe someday soon we'll see bits and pieces of this author listed in the Norton Anthology or the Heath Anthology or one of the anthologies of literary history. So there's sort of two parts then that I want you to do as far as your presentation goes. Well, I guess three parts that are part of the presentation. One is to lead us through an understanding and discussion of the kind of the stakes of the article itself, but then also to, secondly, gesture out towards critical trends. How does this article fit in with other critical trends? And also to kind of gesture out towards that literary period's canon. How does this article, this author, the author that is at the heart of the article, how does that author fit into the canon? Is he or she central? Is he or she kind of marginal? Is there a kind of current interest about that author or that text? And then, if you have time, I'd recommend getting in touch with the faculty in our department who teach in that area, and just ask them if they could say something about what they work on, what their research is, what kinds of things they teach, and maybe include that in the presentation as well. You could see this as sort of advertising each of the different literary periods. Who's working in medieval literature? Who's working in early 19th century antebellum American literature? Who's working in Victorian literature? What classes are they teaching? What kind of scholarship are they doing? And that sort of thing. So then you'll upload that as a presentation that the rest of us can view and use as a way of thinking about, okay, well, these are some of the things that are important about 17th century British literature, or 20th century American literature, or in the example that I've been using, these are some things that are important trends in medieval literature. Okay.